Moving on now to introducing Anthony Vance, an old friend of mine. I think I first met Anthony, I think I figured it out, was November of 1974. No, 73, actually. You were a Harvard freshman, and I was coming to my very first feast in Hartford, Connecticut, and it was over Thanksgiving, so I guess you were home. And so I think that's the first time I met. We also served on a local spiritual assembly together briefly in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Currently, Anthony is the director of the United States Baha'i Office of Public Affairs, based in Washington, D.C. He also has worked in Haifa for 4 years in their external affairs offices, representing the Baha'i Faith in the diplomatic community, civil society, and partly to the host government. He's a lawyer by training, Harvard Law School. Spent 21 years with the U.S. Agency for International Development in legal and managerial positions in Washington, Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya, Botswana, and Egypt. I do seem to remember you telling me about the time you went to a small village in Egypt where they had just initiated a sewer system based by USAID money. Maybe you can clarify that if you want. In addition to his BA in economics, he also has an MBA and a JD. So he's one of those overeducated people that, like me, that we all enjoy being able to offer our services to the faith because of our educations. So without further delay, Anthony, thank you so much for joining us today. We're delighted to have you here, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
It's a real pleasure to be with you today. This is the first time I'm getting a chance to do anything really with the Wilmette Institute other than to chat with Rob from time to time about how it's been developing. So hopefully this will work well. It's a different kind of a presentation for me, and if you can all bear with me, hopefully we can all get something out of today's presentation. Louis Gregory was actually born Louis George in 1874 in Charleston, South Carolina, during the hopeful period of Reconstruction following the Civil War. Like most Black Americans, his parents were slaves. Little is known of Ebenezer George, Louis's father. When Louis was about 5 years old, he died of tuberculosis. For a few years, the family, that is, Louis's mother, maternal grandmother, and brother, struggled in poverty until George Gregory, a freeborn Black veteran of the Civil War, met and married Louis's mother, Mary Elizabeth. George Gregory had been a property owner in Charleston before the Civil War, but abandoned the state to join the Union Army. Interestingly, as a side note, he served as a senior infantryman in a Black regiment led by white Union officers, one of whom was James Brown Thornton Chase, known today simply as Thornton Chase, who some 30 years later would become the first American Baha'i and an outstanding figure in Baha'i history. Thus, in an extraordinary coincidence, George Gregory, one of the senior Black enlisted men under the command of Thornton Chase and other white officers, would raise a young man who would become the most outstanding Black American Baha'i of the 20th century. During the Civil War, neither man, of course, knew that their spiritual destinies were to be so closely related as they struggled to survive the battlefield engagements of their unit, which was the 104th Regiment of the United States Colored Infantry. After his marriage took place sometime around 1880, George Gregory took a great interest in two of his stepsons and assured that they received the best available education in Charleston at the time. First in the public school system, and then later in the Avery Institute, a private high school for Black students run by the American Missionary Association. Louis Gregory graduated from Avery in 1891, and there's his diploma, and then enrolled in Fisk, which of course, as most of you know, had been established immediately after the Civil War in 1866 by the American Missionary Association. There, through a combination of financial support from his family, scholarships, and working as a tailor, a skill he had learned in Charleston at the suggestion of his stepfather. He received his bachelor's degree in 1896. And there we have a copy of that, a black and white copy, which is a little bit more legible than the copy in color here, because the one in color is surrounded by protective protective plastic. In 1900, out of a population of about 9 million blacks in the United States, only about 2,000, or 0.02% had graduated from college or university. Most of those graduates had gone to one of the 34 black colleges, and Fisk was among the cream of those schools. But after teaching for a couple of years at his old high school, Louis Gregory went on to Howard University and earned a law degree in 1902. Later, during the same year, and there are 2 copies of his law degree. By the way, I'm showing these degrees not to prove that Louis Gregory, actually graduated from these institutions, but you can tell in how elaborately they were put together that education so quickly after the Civil War was taken so seriously by those black Americans who could obtain it and those institutions that could provide it for them. Later, during the same year, 1902, Louis Gregory was admitted to the bar of the District of Columbia. There's his admission certificate, and the Supreme Court of the United States. For the next 4 years, Louis Gregory worked first as a lawyer in a small partnership with another black lawyer named James Adlai Cobb, and then obtained a federal job in the Treasury Department. He was during this time agnostic in his beliefs. He was deeply attracted to the writings of W.E.B. Du Bois, particularly The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903, and took great interest in the Niagara movement, formed in 1905, which eventually became subsumed within the newly formed NAACP, that is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, in 1909. Within Washington, D.C., Louis Gregory was active in the social and educational life of the black community in 1907, and in 1907 became the vice president of the Bethel Literary and Historical Society of Washington, D.C., and later its president in 1908. Now we, of course, live in an age of overload in terms of information from an incredible number of sources and media types. But back in 1902, aside from newspapers and books, discussion forums were the main means through which people could inform themselves about the issues of the time. So the Bethel Literary and Historical Society was a pillar of black intellectual and cultural exchange in Washington. It had been founded in 1881 by the AME Church. Its early members were from the church, and its events took place there, but it maintained an open invitation for all black Washingtonians. It became the major forum for presentations by prominent black speakers on issues of race, representing a virtual who's who among black activists and intellectuals. To appreciate who Louis Gregory was and what he was doing with the Bethel Literary and Historical Society, it would be, I think, at this point, appropriate to step back for a moment and remind us all of the context within which he was operating in 1907 through 1909, when he was successively vice president and president of the organization. As you know, in 1877, Reconstruction came to an end and federal troops were withdrawn from the South. Biracial state legislatures were in the coming years replaced by all white bodies as white Southerners reasserted white supremacy over the political and social life of the South. In 1883, the Supreme Court became complicit in a process of eroding federal civil rights laws that had been passed in the 1860s and 1870s. And finally, in 1896, in Plessy versus Ferguson, the court enshrined separate but equal as the governing standard for the constitutional rights of black citizens. From 1884 to 1900, there had been in the United States more than 2,500 lynchings, mainly in the South, and almost entirely of blacks. Simultaneously throughout the country, racial tensions simmered, especially among white working-class whites, some of whom saw competition from black labor as a threat to their survival. Politicians were often all too willing in both the North and the South to stoke these fears. In the first decade of the new century, there was a series of race riots in both northern and southern cities. These riots, unlike those in later years when blacks took a major part in the violence, were actually pogroms against the black community. Two of the worst examples were in Atlanta in September 1906 and Springfield, Illinois in mid-August 1908. In Atlanta, 25 blacks were killed and about 100 more wounded as white mobs roamed the streets for 3 days attacking blacks and black-owned property, their hatred stimulated by sensational journalism and an election campaign that had focused on black voting rights. In Springfield, Illinois, thousands of whites burned down black homes and businesses when they learned that the sheriff had removed 2 black criminal defendants to another jurisdiction for their safety. The 7 deaths, 5 whites and 2 blacks, triggered calls that were a significant factor in causing the leaders of the Niagara movement and others to establish the NAACP. Louis Gregory's upbringing and close contact with both white and blacks in Charleston before the Jim Crow laws were fully implemented in South Carolina in the 1890s provided him with insights into people that were to arm him with an unusual combination of realism without automatic stereotyping. He was fully aware of the brutality of life in the South. Indeed, when he was too young to remember, his grandmother's husband was called out of their home in the middle of the night and lynched merely because he had made the mistake of failing to conceal his wealth. He owned both a mule and a horse, a sign of significant prosperity at the time. Yet at the same time, Louis had daily interactions with whites, including white children before the end of the Reconstruction era, when Union soldiers would sometimes have their families accompany them at post. Moreover, George Gregory was a highly respected person in the black community and among many whites. So it's not surprising that Louis Gregory wrote later, quote, "I cannot recall a time when at least some whites of the South could not be found who were willing for the colored race to have every right and opportunity on the basis of merit, which they themselves enjoyed," end quote. As we'll see later on, this rich and varied experience in the South armed Louis Gregory with what some might regard as 2 contradictory capacities: a clear-eyed understanding of the realities of race in the United States, and an ability to ignore stereotypes of both races. Certainly during his days before and during law school, and later during his intense days of activity in the Bethel Literary and Historical Society, he undoubtedly noticed and discussed with others the fact that the lone dissenter in the Plessy decision, Justice John Marshall Harlan, who delivered, by the way, a stinging rebuke to the majority opinion, was actually a white Southerner from Kentucky who had owned slaves, while ironically, 5 justices from the North, together with 1 from California, voted in favor of this infamous ruling. I mention all of this simply to say that in the years to come, although Louis Gregory's greatest success was with the black community in sharing the principle of the oneness of humanity, the core principle of the Baha'i Faith, he also met with considerable success in reaching whites, never permitting stereotypes to prevent him from sharing spiritual concepts. And by the way, the Plessy decision also reemphasizes that legal pedigree means little without values. 3 of the judges in the majority upholding discrimination were educated at the Harvard and Yale law schools, while Justice Harlan received his legal education at Transylvania Law School in Lexington, Kentucky. A good school, but obviously far less well known than Harvard and Yale. In 1906, Louis Gregory and his law partner closed their 2-person law practice, and Mr. Gregory joined the U.S. Treasury Department. He occupied a desk between 2 older gentlemen, one from the north and the other from the south. Over time, a close friendship developed between the 3 men, even though they could hardly have been more different in terms of their views. Louis could trigger debate between the 2 at the drop of a hat, especially on any topic related to the Civil War. His own views had been influenced by W.E.B. Du Bois and were regarded as radical at the time. Interestingly, though, it was the Southerner who invited Louis to his home to meet his wife. This was only a few years after the outrage that was expressed by many whites when President Theodore Roosevelt had Booker T. Washington to dinner at the White House in 1901. The Southerner also gave Louis a pamphlet one day about a Baha'i meeting, thinking that he might find it of interest, given that it seemed to reflect some of his radical views. This led to his meeting Pauline and Joseph Hannon, also Southerners, now living in Washington, D.C., but people who had become Baha'is 5 years earlier and had totally embraced the concept of the oneness of humanity. Over the course of 2 years, they gradually introduced to him the Baha'i teachings, and he accepted this new faith in 1909. Writing later about the small gatherings at their home, he said, quote, "The light they unfolded was so wonderful that for about a year we sat in dumb amazement, listening to their patient, loving talks," end quote. As was the custom at the time, every new Baha'i wrote a letter to Abdu'l-Bahá, the son of Baha'u'llah and his chosen successor to lead the Bahá'í Faith. And in that letter, the person would declare his faith in Baha'u'llah. In response to Louis Gregory's letter, Abdu'l-Bahá wrote this rather remarkable statement, quote, "I hope that thou mayest become the means whereby the white and colored people shall close their eyes to racial differences and behold the reality of humanity." In 1911, Louis Gregory went on pilgrimage to Haifa and Akka, 2 cities in what is today northern Israel and what was then the Palestine of the Ottoman Empire. His purpose was not only to visit and pray at the resting place of Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder of the Baha'i Faith, who had been exiled to the prison city of Akka and had been laid to rest near the city in 1892, but also to meet Abdu'l-Bahá. During this pilgrimage, Abdu'l-Bahá informed Louis with a wider and deeper understanding of the Baha'i teachings, and most importantly, infused in him a vision for the future of the human race and a love of God and for the entire human race that was never to leave him for the rest of his life. It's impossible to gain an adequate understanding of what Louis Gregory was able to do with the rest of his life and the sacrifices he would willingly make without an understanding of the impact of his meeting with Abdu'l-Bahá. Now, black lawyers were a rare commodity in the United States at the turn of the 20th century. And to appreciate the accomplishment of becoming one, it might be instructive to take a moment and look back at some of the earliest examples of black lawyers. Born free in Indiana, Macon Bowling Allen is generally believed to be the first Black American licensed to practice law in the United States and to hold a judicial position. After learning about the law as a clerk for a liberal white lawyer in Maine, he passed the bar exam in Maine in 1844. Then he moved to Massachusetts within a year, was admitted to the bar, and was appointed as a Massachusetts Justice of the Peace in 1847 and reappointed in 1854. He also continued to practice law in Massachusetts. He was the first African American to hold a judicial post in the United States of any type. After the Civil War, he relocated to South Carolina, was admitted to the bar there, was politically active, and was appointed or elected to judicial positions in lower-level state courts. After Reconstruction, he left South Carolina for Washington, D.C., where he worked as a lawyer and died in 1894. George Louis Ruffin was born in Richmond, Virginia. Born free in Richmond, Virginia. In fact, Richmond had the largest free Black community in the United States in the South prior to the Civil War, about 20,000 free Blacks. His family was part of the significant free Black population that lived there. His family moved to Boston in 1853 when he was 19 years old. He worked at first as a barber, then as an assistant to a couple of Boston lawyers, even writing law journal articles. He was admitted to the Harvard Law School and became its first Black graduate in 1869. He practiced law, was politically active, and attended the National Negro Convention of 1864 and of 1872. This was a series of national conventions both before and after the Civil War, and was elected to the Massachusetts State Legislature in 1870 for one term. He was the first Black to be elected to the Boston City Council, serving 2 terms from 1875 to 1877. And in 1883, he was appointed by the Massachusetts governor as the first Black municipal judge in Massachusetts. He died in 1886. Robert Morris was born in Salem, Massachusetts, and received legal training from a Massachusetts abolitionist and lawyer named Ellis Gray Loring. In 1847, he became the first Black lawyer in the United States to file a lawsuit on behalf of a client. His client was white, and the jury ruled in his favor. Unfortunately, the details of the case are unknown, but Morris later recalled his feelings about the trial. Quote, "There was something in the courtroom that made me feel like a giant. The courtroom was filled with colored people, and I could see expressed on the faces of every one of them the wish that I might win the first case that had ever been tried before a jury by a colored attorney in this country." End quote. In the same year, 1847, Morris brought the first school desegregation case in the United States, as he represented a Black elementary school girl, Sarah Roberts, and her father in suing the Boston public school system to desegregate its schools. He lost at the trial level and was ultimately joined by the abolitionist and future radical Republican Congressman Charles Sumner at the level of the Massachusetts Supreme Court. The two filed the first ever brief by a Black and white lawyer together. They lost at the appellate level, but in 1855, directly as a result of the publicity created by the case, the Massachusetts state legislature banned segregation of public schools. An active abolitionist, Morris was one of the attorneys who defended Shadrach Minkins, a fugitive slave from Virginia who had settled in Boston and worked as a waiter. In 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, and federal marshals arrested Minkins in February of 1851. Morris went so far as to collude with others to have the Boston Vigilance Committee forcibly take Shadrach Minkins from the authorities after they lost their case in court, and then had him hidden and finally secreted out of Massachusetts to Montreal in permanent freedom. There was a trial, by the way, of against the people who took this action, and I don't know how it occurred that they were acquitted, but they were acquitted after taking the action that they took. In 1854, Morris was one of the lawyers unsuccessfully defending another fugitive slave who had escaped from Virginia. However, the case was a propaganda victory for the abolitionists, as the deployment of federal troops to Boston to avoid having that slave forcibly removed and sent off to Canada, as had taken place with Shadrach Minkins. Further, the deployment of federal troops further incited public opinion against the Fugitive Slave Act. Morris was probably the first black lawyer in the United States to make a commercial success out of being a lawyer, earning some $3,000 per year, a substantial sum at the time. And most of his clients were actually immigrants, white immigrants who came to the United States after the Civil War. So let's move on to some of the black lawyers who spoke at the Bethel Literary and Historical Society. As I mentioned before, Louis Gregory was vice president and then president of the society only from 1907 to 1909. So it's unlikely that all of the following individuals spoke during his years of leadership in the society. But these are the kinds of people, along with many from the arts, politics, education, and the sciences, with whom he came in contact and invited to speak. I'm drawing attention to people here who were of particular note in terms of their legal work for civil rights or in the field of legal education. John Mercer Langston, born a free black in Virginia to a freed woman of mixed race and a white planter, and then later in 1888, Langston was the first black elected to the U.S. Congress from Virginia. He was brought up in Ohio. He attended Oberlin College, earning a bachelor's degree in 1849. He was denied admission to law school in New York and Ohio because of his race. He then apprenticed with an abolitionist attorney and congressman and was admitted to the bar in 1854. Together with his older brothers, he helped runaway slaves escape north along the Ohio part of the Underground Railroad. In 1858, he became president of the Ohio Anti-Slavery Society. After the federal government authorized the recruitment of black troops during the Civil War, he recruited over 1,000 men for service. After the war, he was appointed the Inspector General for the Freedmen's Bureau. In 1868, he moved to Washington, D.C. to help establish the Howard University Law School, the first black law school in the country, and served as its first dean. In the early 1870s, he assisted Senator Charles Sumner with the drafting of the Civil Rights Act of 1875. In 1888, he became the first black elected to Congress from Virginia and served in Congress until 1893, when the Jim Crow laws became fully effective in Virginia and black representation in the legislature largely came to an end. Archibald Grimke, born into slavery in South Carolina, he was the eldest of 3 sons of Nancy Weston, an enslaved woman of European and African descent, and her master, Henry W. Grimke, a widower. The Grimkes were a large slaveholding family. Henry nevertheless recognized his slave children, and as he was dying in 1852, made unsuccessful arrangements to have them cared for. However, through the help of others, after the Civil War, Archibald attended Lincoln University, which had been newly established for black students. He and his brother Francis excelled there. With the Grimke last name, they came to the attention of the abolitionist sisters, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, who, because of their anti-slavery views, had left South Carolina before the Civil War and settled in the North. They discovered quickly that Archibald and Francis were the sons of their deceased brother Henry, and arranged to finance Archibald's and Frances's legal education at Harvard and Howard universities, respectively. Archibald Grimke became the editor of The Hub, a Republican newspaper designed to attract black readers. He used it and his lectures to call for equal rights in the face of the reinstituting of white supremacy in the South. He also became active, like his aunts, in the women's rights movement and was elected president of the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association. In 1907, he became involved with the Niagara movement and later with the NAACP. In 1913, he became the president of the Washington, D.C. branch of the NAACP. Grimke led the public protest in Washington, D.C. against the segregation of federal offices under President Woodrow Wilson. He testified before Congress against it in 1914 and was part of a process that mitigated the practice but was unsuccessful in reversing it. He became a national vice president of the NAACP in 1914 and then worked to change discrimination against blacks in the military during World War I. Ida B. Wells, another individual who spoke before the Bethel Literary and Historical Society, is the only person not trained as a lawyer in this group. She, in fact, worked as a journalist, but her investigative journalism and very lawyerly attention to facts and details surrounding lynchings in the South unmasked the true motives behind this practice. As a journalist and activist, she documented lynching in the United States in the 1890s, showing that it was often used in the South as a way to control or punish black people who competed economically with whites, rather than for criminal acts, especially the rape of white women, which was the common claim of many whites. Born in Mississippi in 1862, her parents were both slaves in the household of an architect. After the war, during Reconstruction, she attended the newly created Shaw University, but was expelled at the age of 16 for rebellious behavior after confronting the college president. At the age of 16, she lost her parents to a yellow fever epidemic and managed by various means to keep her younger siblings from being split up. She taught elementary school in Mississippi and then later in Tennessee, where she arranged to have her younger siblings stay with relatives. In summers, she took courses at Fisk University. In 1889, after a friend of hers was lynched after he defended from a mob his newly opened grocery store, which competed with a white-owned store across the street, she began a career in investigative journalism. This went beyond the writing that she had already done for various papers about discrimination in the South. In 1891, she was dismissed from her teaching position in the Memphis public schools for criticizing the condition of black schools in an article. In 1893, she published a pamphlet entitled Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases, which examined many accounts of lynchings allegedly due to the rape of white women and concluded that many Southerners cried rape as an excuse to hide their real reasons for lynchings. Black economic progress, which threatened white Southerners with competition, and a fear of social equality between blacks and whites. In 1895, she published The Red Record, another pamphlet, but at 100 pages, much more extensive than Southern Horrors. It provided 14 pages of statistics related to lynchings between 1892 and 1895. She also included pages of graphic accounts detailing specific lynchings and noting that her data was taken from articles from white correspondents, white press bureaus, and white-owned newspapers. She not only spoke extensively in the United States on speaking tours, but also in Europe, where she brought photographs with her, fully aware of the fact that her audiences would initially be in disbelief of the written descriptions of the scenes of brutality that had taken place in the United States. Her tour in the United Kingdom led to the formation of the British Anti-Lynching Committee, which included prominent figures such as the head of the Church of England, the Archbishop of Canterbury, members of Parliament, and editors of the Manchester Guardian. In the US, she raised awareness and through her detailed data collection, provided tremendous support for the anti-lynching movement that arose in the late 1890s and continued well into the first 2 decades of the 20th century. It would probably be no exaggeration to say that the sharp decline in lynchings in the United States after 1930 was in large part influenced by her work. Prior to her work, most Northern whites were unaware of the extent to which lynching occurred in the United States. However, by 1895, knowledge of it was pervasive. Indeed, as a result of her work, she had become so famous that her wedding in 1895 was a front-page story in the New York Times. About a decade and a half later, she became one of the founding members of the NAACP. Ellie Miller was born in South Carolina to a former slave, his mother, and a freedman. He attended Howard University from 1882 to 1886, completing studies in Latin, Greek, and mathematics, demonstrating exceptional academic ability. His talent did not go unnoticed, and he was enrolled in studies in mathematics, physics, and astronomy at Johns Hopkins University from 1887 to 1889, the first black student to attend the university. Miller received a law degree from Howard in 1903, the year after Louis Gregory received his. He was a prolific writer and wrote several books about the black condition in America, including Out of the House of Bondage. He assisted Du Bois with editing the NAACP's journal, The Crisis. In 1907, he began 12 years as the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Howard University. In 1917, he published an open letter to President Woodrow Wilson in the Baltimore Afro-American, a newspaper in Baltimore at the time, against lynching. John Mercer Langston, Archibald Grimke, Ida B. Wells, and Kelly Miller all worked to further the civil rights of African Americans, and all were involved in educating either students or the public. They represent a small sampling of the many prominent African Americans who spoke before the Bethel Literary and Historical Society when Louis Gregory was associated with it or leading it. In 1908, the Young Turk Revolution freed most of the prisoners of conscience in the Ottoman Empire, including Abdu'l-Bahá, the head of the Bahá'í Faith. Although under a liberal house arrest since the mid-1870s, the events of 1908 freed him to visit the newly developing Bahá'í communities in Europe and and North America. In 1911, he traveled to Europe, then to Egypt, and then on to North America, arriving there in New York in April of 1912. His goal was to promote his father's teachings, deepen the understanding of the verities of the Bahá'í Faith among the roughly 1,500 adherents across the United States, and try to influence statesmen and leaders of thought in ways that he hoped would avoid World War I. While he was unsuccessful with the last goal, with respect to the first two, he was extremely successful, as during his stay of 239 days in the United States and Canada, reaching all the way to the West Coast, he spoke to a wide array of audiences, sharing basic Bahá'í teachings about the oneness of humanity, the oneness of religion, gender and racial equality, the importance of universal education, and the harmony of science and religion. He spent more time in Washington, D.C. than in any other single city. During this time, Louis Gregory had the opportunity to renew his close association with Abdu'l-Bahá, including arranging for him to speak at Howard University on April 23, 1912, and later on the same day to the Bethel Literary and Historical Society. In the latter talk, Abdu'l-Bahá spent most of the time addressing his audience on the importance of education, particularly in the sciences, describing them as gifts and bounties from God. Then he continued, quote, "How shall we utilize these gifts and expend these bounties? By directing our efforts toward the unification of the human race. We must use these powers in establishing the oneness of the world of humanity. Appreciate these virtues by accomplishing the unity of whites and blacks. Devote this divine intelligence to the perfecting of amity and accord among all branches of the human family, so that under the protection and providence of God, the East and the West may hold each other's hands and become as lovers. Then will mankind be as one nation, one race and kind, as waves of one ocean." End quote. Louis Gregory was also probably present on April 30th, 1912, when Abdu'l-Bahá spoke at Hull House in Chicago, and then later on the same day at the 4th Annual Convention of the NAACP. Earlier in the day, he had heard Abdu'l-Bahá speak at the closing session of the Baha'i National Convention in Chicago. So it was probable that he followed Abdu'l-Bahá during the remaining portion of the day's itinerary. Both events were covered, that is, both the event at Hull House and the other NAACP talk were covered by Du Bois in the NAACP's journal, The Crisis, with Du Bois devoting portions of 2 issues to an explanation of the faith's teachings and featuring Abdu'l-Bahá as the journal's Man of the Month in its May 1912 issue. Robert Abbott, whose Chicago Defender was the most widely read black publication in the United States, also covered the visit. Abbott, greatly impressed by Abdu'l-Bahá, later became a Baha'i in 1934. At this time, the central principle of the Baha'i Faith, the oneness of humanity, was not fully understood in terms of its implications, certainly not by the small portion of the general public that had heard of it, and to a significant degree the Baha'i community itself. In the area of race in particular, the United States in both North and South was steeped in traditions and beliefs that many took for granted. Did oneness simply mean accepting each other as brothers spiritually and perhaps with some limited social interaction? Or did it mean more than this? In the background at the time, aside from the overt racism in society, was the pseudoscience of the era proclaiming that whites were intellectually superior to blacks. It's noteworthy that Abdu'l-Bahá addressed this issue, and Louis Gregory would later do the same in an elaborate way in one of his own articles. Abdu'l-Bahá gave 2 talks on April 30th, 2012, to the NAACP's 4th Annual Convention and at Hull House. At the first at Hull House, in speaking of whites and blacks, he stated, quote, "In physical bodies, in the law of growth, in sense endowment, intelligence, patriotism, language, citizenship, civilization, and religion, you are one and the same. A single point of distinction exists, that of racial color. God is not pleased with, nor should any reasonable or intelligent man be willing to recognize inequality in the races because of this distinction." End quote. Louis Gregory accompanied Abdu'l-Bahá to Chicago as did several other individuals, including Louisa Matthew, a white British Baha'i from an upper middle class family whom he had met in 1911 when both were on pilgrimage and had visited Abdu'l-Bahá in Egypt. Although they liked each other and admired the services that each had rendered to the Baha'i Faith, they had not even remotely considered the possibility that their relationship would go beyond friendship. In talks and comments in Egypt when they were present, Abdu'l-Bahá had mentioned that black and white Baha'is should not only be in unity, but should intermarry. Later, Louisa Matthew, who lived in Paris, was in the entourage that accompanied Abdu'l-Bahá to the United States. During that voyage, he first hinted very subtly about a seed he saw growing in her heart. She, in turn, had no idea what he was talking about and thought that it was some spiritual matter. Later in the U.S., he gave her a white flower, which he wished for her to give to Louis Gregory, and, as she put it, quote, looking at me in a peculiar way, conveyed his meaning to me that he wished me to marry Mr. Gregory, end quote. In a letter to a friend she wrote later, she said, curiously enough, after this, love began to grow in my heart and the desire for the marriage, whereas before I only liked Mr. Gregory as a friend. Later, she was again in Abdu'l-Bahá's entourage during the trip to Chicago. On the train, in front of a few other Baha'is, he asked, "How are you and Mr. Gregory getting along?" Startled, she answered, "What do you mean? We're good friends." To which he replied emphatically and with his face wreathed in mischievous smiles, "You must be very good friends," with an emphasis on the word very. Later, before Abdu'l-Bahá and the party left Chicago, she approached him and asked plainly one morning if she had understood that he wished Mr. Gregory and herself to marry. He said, yes, he did wish it. "I wish the white and the colored people to marry," he added. Then she indicated that as a woman, it was inappropriate for her to take the initiative to bring this about. Then he asked, "Do you love him? Would you marry him if he asked you?" And she replied, "Yes." Then he said, "If he loves you, he will ask you." Later in the morning, as she learned sometime afterwards, Abdu'l-Bahá told Louis Gregory that it would give him much pleasure if he and Louisa Matthew would marry, which came as a complete surprise to Louis Gregory. Abdu'l-Bahá said to him, "What is the matter? Don't you love her?" "Yes, as a friend," he replied. "Well, think of it," said Abdu'l-Bahá, "and let me know. Marriage is not an ordinance, and need not be obeyed, but it would give me much pleasure if you and Miss Matthew were to marry." 5 months later, Louis and Louisa Gregory were married in New York City on September 27, 1912. Their marriage lasted for almost 40 years until his death in 1951. Their marriage was another indication of what Baha'u'llah's teaching of the oneness of humanity meant. It broke down all barriers. It included the marriage of a white woman to a black man, the biggest taboo in American society at the time. Abdu'l-Bahá had already indicated that the unity of the black and white races in the United States would help to facilitate world peace. The fact that interracial marriage was prohibited in 25 of the 48 states at the time was not for him a deterrent. Louis Gregory understood this. He also understood that in the Deep South and in some other areas where he had traveled and would continue to travel extensively promoting the Baha'i teachings, he could be lynched if the knowledge of his marriage became known to some of the people that he encountered. As it was, the dangers forced him not to travel with her in the southern states. In 1950, a year before his death, he described his wife as having been, quote, "a tower of strength to me," end quote. Excuse me. Louis Gregory was an accomplished professional who had risen from poverty. His wife was from a wealthy upper-middle-class family from the south of England. She had studied economics and languages at Cambridge University and had become a Baha'i while studying voice in France. Despite her background, she was unassuming and, even as a friend described her, shy and modest. Yet she undertook trips throughout Europe for many years to promote the Baha'i teachings and the oneness of humanity in a manner that would mirror in many ways her husband's work in the United States. After the marriage took place, it became known among the Baha'is that Abdu'l-Bahá had suggested it. It then became inevitable that a fuller meaning of the oneness of humanity would become apparent to all Baha'is in the United States. For some, such as the Hannans, Louis Gregory's first Baha'i teachers, it was natural. For others, so consciously or unconsciously accustomed to the social conventions of the day, full acceptance would take a longer period of time. Outside of the Baha'i community, there was a great deal of controversy. Louis Gregory, as a Black professional and as a leader of the Bethel Literary and Historical Society, was very well known in Washington, D.C., especially in the Black community. He had already been a topic of some ridicule for having joined in 1909 an obscure Eastern religion, although the visit of Abdu'l-Bahá to the United States had greatly increased the prestige of the Baha'i faith. Abdu'l-Bahā's uplifting, encouraging demeanor, his clarity, and his attachment to principle impressed both high and low alike. Du Bois's articles about him in The Crisis and Abbott's coverage in the Chicago Defender had familiarized and legitimized the Baha'i faith in the eyes of many African Americans. There was also extensive coverage of Abdu'l-Bahá in the white-owned media. However, the marriage to Louisa Matthew provoked the same kind of negative commentary, but on a smaller scale, that had met Frederick Douglass's marriage 28 years earlier to Helen Pitts, a white woman, the daughter of abolitionist parents, who had served as his secretary. The Gregorys would persevere, however, quite confident that they were part of a movement and a spiritual phenomenon that was unprecedented in human history. In 1910, Louis Gregory began to devote substantial amounts of his time spreading the Baha'i teachings on trips throughout the United States. By 1917, he was doing this full time and had decided to abandon a small business that he had started. His travels and lectures in both the North and the South met extraordinary receptivity among both Black and white audiences. In 1922, he was elected to the national governing body of the Baha'is of the United States, the newly formed 9-member National Spiritual Assembly. He continued to be elected annually and serve on that body for 14 of the 24 years between 1922 and 1946, until ill health in 1946 forced him to resign. By this time, Elsie Austin, a Black lawyer from Ohio, had been elected to the NSA, so that for a short period of time, 2 of the 9 members were African American. Decades later, having as many as 3 African American members of the National Spiritual Assembly became not uncommon, and there has never been a period since 1970 when at least 2 of the 9 members were not African Americans. Thus, from 1922 to 1946, Louis Gregory was distinctive in that he was a Black man serving on the decision-making body of a national organization made up primarily of white members. At the urging of Abdu'l-Bahá, race amity conventions were initiated by the Baha'is across the United States. The first occurred in Washington, D.C. in 1921 and lasted 3 days. Unfortunately, we don't have any photos from that, or at least none that I know of. If any of you out there know of any, it would be a priceless find if you could identify them for us. A number of Baha'i and non-Baha'i speakers, including members of Congress, participated. Part of the backdrop to this were the terrible race riots that had hit a number of American cities, including Washington, D.C., 2 years earlier in 1919. The Red Summer, as it came to be known, had greatly discouraged all Americans, whether Black or white, who cared about racial justice. When consulted about the nature of the Washington, D.C. event, Louis Gregory, who had been willing with the social and economic who had been familiar with the social and economic interracial conferences that had taken place in response to the riots, wanted to make sure that the Race Amity Conference did not follow suit. He had found those conferences to be sterile. He commented to Agnes Parsons, a Washington, D.C. Baha'i, and the chief organizer of the D.C. conference, quote, "Nothing short of a change of hearts will do. Unless the speakers are able to make the power of love felt, the occasion will lose its chief value, end quote. He ended up being one of many speakers, both Baha'i and non-Baha'is, who spoke. The attendance was about 2,000 people, and it was probably, the room probably looks similar to a race amity conference that was organized only a few months later in Springfield, Massachusetts, at a high school there at which over 2,000 people were in attendance. The following excerpt from Mr. Gregory's address provide a strong sense of what he always sought to convey, regardless of the specific topic. Referring to the effect of the inception of the Baha'i Faith and its growing influence, he said, quote, "The divine springtime has appeared, and the great enlightened principles, which are the light and progress of the whole world of humanity, are set in motion. These relate to the great peace, the universality of truth, to the great law that humanity is one, even as God is one, to the elevation of the station of woman, who must no longer be confined to a limited life, but be everywhere recognized as the equal and helpmate of man. These pertain to the universality of education, to the oneness of language, to the solution of this economic problem which has vexed the greatest minds of the world and its noblest hearts, and to that supreme dynamic power, the Holy Spirit of God, whose outpourings upon the world of flesh will make this a world of light, of joy, and of triumph." Louis Gregory could also be very analytical when he spoke. For instance, I referred earlier to the racial theories supported by the pseudoscience that was popular at the time that were used to justify a system of white supremacy. In one 1928 article, Louis Gregory refuted these theories with extensive quotes and citations to experts in anthropology and other fields. But at the same time, he always knew that good science was not enough. Sentiments, as he put it, had to change. He ended his article by saying that it is, quote, "the awakening of the spiritual life, the assurance of the way of God, and the enkindlement of the flame of divine love which removes all clouds. To forsake prejudice is better than to amass wealth. The conquest of animosities is far greater than victory over one's foes. The struggle for universal good is far nobler than the desire for personal success," end quote. Service, not only on the National Spiritual Assembly, but also on its Race Amity Committee and later its Race Unity Committee, would form a large portion of Louis Gregory's life until near its end. Those committees were charged with preparing a compilation on race for general distribution, holding race amity conferences across the country, and bringing the Baha'i teachings to the attention of other groups working for unity. He worked closely with Alain Locke on the NSA's Race Amity Committee. Locke was the first Black Rhodes Scholar and philosophical and historical parent of the Harlem Renaissance. He had become a Baha'i in 1918. The two served together with Black and white Baha'is on the Race Amity Committee beginning in 1927 and worked together on various aspects of race unity, especially as speakers through the mid-1940s. They oversaw and often participated in scores of race amity conferences across the United States, often collaborating with other organizations. Here, for example, is a slide showing the Race Amity Conference in New York City on November 8th and 9th of 1930, co-sponsored by the Urban League and the Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of New York City. You can see Louis Gregory towards the center, a little bit towards the back, a little bit to the right of center in this particular photo. When Louis Gregory passed away in 1951, he had succeeded in spreading the Baha'i teachings to several hundred localities across the entire United States, many of which he visited several times. The impact in the growth of Baha'i communities across the U.S. was probably greater than that of any other single Baha'i since the visit of Abdu'l-Bahá to the United States in 1912. His warmth, modesty, and unaffected nature hid an unshakable resolve and faith that caused him to persevere in the face of ridicule, apathy, and opposition. And his freedom from stereotypes permitted him to find friends in some of the least likely places. His old law partner, James Adlai Cobb, who in 1907 became the first black special assistant to the Attorney General of the United States, outlived him. Upon his death, Mr. Cobb wrote, "It was my privilege, quote, it was my privilege to have known Mr. Gregory intimately from 1895 until a short time before his passing. I knew him as a student, teacher, practicing lawyer, lecturer, and friend, and in each capacity he was strong and outstanding. In other words, he was a fine student, a lovely character, and a person with a great mind, which he devoted to the betterment of mankind. Those of us who knew him well cannot but mourn his loss, but there should be some comfort in the fact that he lived long and well, and those with whom he came in contact were and are better for their association with him. In fact, he was one of those who enriched the life of America," end quote. Always seeking the transcendent path, Louis Gregory had been described by Abdu'l-Bahá as, quote, "like unto pure gold," end quote, a comparison that I'm not aware of him providing to anyone else. I mentioned earlier that African-American membership on the National Governing Council of the Baha'is of the United States, the National Spiritual Assembly, became a constant after Louis Gregory. The first to serve on that institution after him was Elsie Austin, who was elected in 1946 and overlapped with Louis Gregory for a few months before ill health caused him to retire. Miss Austin became a Baha'i in 1934, was appointed Assistant Attorney General for the state of Ohio in 1937, the first black woman to hold such a position. She was also the first black female law graduate of the University of Cincinnati in 1930, having been selected for their law review in 1928. She served on the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States from 1946 until 1953, when she and several other members of the NSA arose and left the United States to assist with the international goals of the faith. She considered Louis Gregory to be a mentor of hers and wrote a short biography about him after his passing. She lived overseas in Morocco, Nigeria, Kenya, and the Bahamas, and served on the regional governing body for the Baha'is of North and West Africa from 1953 to 1958. Matthew Bullock was born to a poor North Carolina family that moved to Boston when he was in elementary school, received his law degree from Harvard in 1907. He went into private practice for a while, but then spent much of the remainder of his career in a variety of state and federal posts, including Special Assistant Attorney General for Massachusetts and positions within the U.S. Department of Justice. He became a Baha'i in 1940 and a member of the National Spiritual Assembly in 1952. In 1953, he left the U.S., like Elsie Austin, to assist with the international goals of the faith, arriving in Curacao, Dutch West Indies, at the age of 72 in 1953. He received an honorary degree from Harvard at their commencement exercise in 1970, and another at the age of 90, accompanied by a standing ovation at Dartmouth College at their commencement exercise a year or two later. That degree from Dartmouth cited his concern for, quote, the establishment of universal justice and freedom, end quote. And this is a photo of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States in 1953, and you can see, of course, Elsie Austin fourth from the left and Matthew Bullock, of course, on the far right. Now, getting back to the contributions of African-American lawyers to the progress of civil rights race unity and justice in the United States. We'll touch on a few more that were particularly outstanding, and then we'll close the presentation. William H. Lewis, in 1903, became the first assistant U.S. attorney, the first Black assistant U.S. attorney in the United States. And in 1910, the first U.S. assistant attorney general. He graduated from the Harvard Law School. His parents had been former slaves. And he was, throughout his life, an advocate for civil rights in his articles and his speeches. Charles Hamilton Houston, in 1923, became the first Black member of the Harvard Law Review. He served from 1929 to 1935 as the vice dean and then dean of the Howard Law School. He trained many of the lawyers who would lead the struggle for civil rights, including Thurgood Marshall. From 1935 to 1940, he left Howard so that he could work for the NAACP, becoming the architect of the strategy to end desegregation, starting with graduate schools, and then working all the way through the public school system and public facilities. Thurgood Marshall certainly gives him the credit for having been truly the father of the civil rights movement, or the legal aspect of the civil rights movement. Of course, Thurgood Marshall had too many really accomplishments to give justice to here. He won 29 of 32 civil rights cases argued before the U.S. Supreme Court. He was a graduate of Howard's Law School, where, of course, he was taught by Charles Hamilton Houston. The biggest case, of course, that he won was the Brown case in 1954. But he won others that led to the Brown case, that were stepping stones to the Brown case. He became the first Black U.S. Solicitor General to the United States and the first Black U.S. Supreme Court Justice. William Henry Hastie also was a graduate of the Harvard Law School. He was the first Black to become a U.S. federal district court judge in 1937. He became the dean of the Howard Law School in 1939. He co-led with Thurgood Marshall one of the significant voting right cases in 1944. And in 1950, he became and served for 22 years as the first U.S. Court of Appeals judge. Spotswood William Robinson III. His father was a lawyer, the only person in this group who came from such a background. He joined the Howard University faculty in 1939. He litigated several civil rights cases in his native Virginia, one of which was part of a composite case, set of cases that were combined together into the Brown case in 1954. He also worked on a case to desegregate racial segregation in interstate transportation. He was the dean of the Howard Law School from 1960 to 1963. He was the first Black U.S. district judge for the District of Columbia, that is, federal district court judge for the District of Columbia in 1964, and was named in 1966 as the first Black U.S. appellate court judge for the D.C. Court of Appeals. Constance Baker Motley graduated from Columbia University in 1946, their law school. She was actually one of the authors of the brief that was utilized before the Supreme Court in the Brown case. She joined the NAACP Legal Defense Fund immediately out of law school. She became the first African-American woman to argue a case before the U.S. Supreme Court. She won 9 of 10 cases that she argued before the court, including one for James Meredith's admission to the University of Mississippi in 1962. Later, she became the first African-American woman federal district court judge. Julius Chambers grew up poor in rural Montgomery County in North Carolina. In fact, he said that when he was in high school, he could barely read and write. Somehow, he managed to, through sheer intellect and force of will, to graduate at the top, near the top of his class at North Carolina Central University, one of the historically black colleges and universities. Then moving on to the University of North Carolina's law school at Chapel Hill, and became the first black editor-in-chief of their law review, graduating first in his class there in 1962. He started a small law firm in Charlotte, won a key school busing case before the U.S. Supreme Court, and a couple of Title VII employment discrimination cases in 1971. Over the course of 6 years of doing civil rights cases, his car, his office, and his home were firebombed. From 1984 to 1993, he was the executive director of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And then later in 1993, from 2001, he served as the chancellor of his undergraduate alma mater, North Carolina Central University. Clyde Ferguson was the dean of Howard's Law School from 1963 to 1969. He had graduated from Harvard Law School and had been a member of the Harvard Law Review. In 1970, he was named the United States Ambassador to Uganda. In 1973, he became a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Africa. In 1976, he joined the Harvard Law School faculty, one of the first black faculty there. In fact, I got some advice from him on my third-year law school paper. But more importantly, in 1982, when there was severe persecution of the Baha'is in Iran, I knew that he had served in the State Department, and we decided that I should approach him about ideas that perhaps might be useful. And the first words out of his mouth when I mentioned the situation of the Baha'is in Iran was, "Oh, my dear sister Velma is a Baha'i, and she's been living in East Africa for a long period of time." And in fact, Velma Ferguson was a pioneer to Uganda, primarily in East Africa, and then later was a pioneer to South Korea. She passed away a couple of years ago. Her brother passed away prematurely in 1983 from a heart attack. Patricia Harris finished first in her class at George Washington University's law school in 1960, was the first African-American woman ambassador, named as ambassador to Luxembourg in 1965. She was the first female dean of the Howard University Law School, the first black female secretary of Housing and Urban Development in 1977, and likewise the first black female Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare when she was named to that position in 1979. Lana Guinier has done a great deal of civil rights work, was named to the faculty of the Harvard Law School, the first tenured African-American woman to that faculty in 1999. Eric Holder was the first black U.S. Attorney General of the United States, and Loretta Lynch, the first black female Attorney General of the United States. A lot more could be said about a lot of these people. I've tried to keep this within reasonable limits, but if I have really short shrift certain topics, my apologies, but thank you very much to everybody for listening in, and the floor would be open now to any comments or questions that any of you may have.
Thank you so much, Anthony. It's just such a thrilling story. to see what African Americans have contributed to our country and to the fight for freedom and equality in this country. And it's really extremely exciting to see all of this and all this information and to sort of learn a bit about these people. And of course, Thornton Chase, possibly knowing Louis Gregory's father, I had no idea. I wasn't aware that he was also in the 104th. So that's really fascinating for me. Quite intriguing. I wonder if it was the same company. If you probably don't know which company he was in, do you?
No, I only know the regiment.
Yeah.
That kind of information is available at the African American Civil War Museum in Washington, D.C. If anyone is interested in, getting further information on that, they have a website where that one can go to and pose questions or actually do research.
Yeah, I'll have to look into that because I don't know whether Thornton Chase was a commanding officer of his particular troop. There were, I think, 6 or 8 troops in each regiment, and each troop had 100 men or something like that, with a captain in charge of the troop. So I am curious, and I'm also really interested in seeing if we can ever find some photos of the 104th. That would be quite interesting as well. They might have those at that museum as well.
Yeah.
There are a few questions that have come in, and I'm sure we will get some more. The one particular person asked, do we know specifically what convinced Louis Gregory to become a Baha'i? Not just necessarily the experience of, going to the Hannon's house, but was there a particular event or a particular moment or a particular idea that did it?
Yeah, in the accounts that I have read, there is no particular moment or a particular thing that he mentions as having taken him from disbelief to belief.
Interesting. Another question, and actually I should mention Steve Collins, who does a lot of newspaper research, mentioned a few things in his comments on the YouTube channel, one of which was that in 1907, the Washington Bee newspaper, which was the African-American newspaper in town, reported that Louis Gregory and ex-judge E.M. Hewlett went to a segregated lunch counter cafeteria at the Capitol building. And I don't know whether they were served or not. Perhaps they were. But that was something that Steve has done some research on.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm very happy to hear you say that. Of course, Louis Gregory wasn't a Baha'i yet, but he did something very similar. I'm going to have to look this up and figure out where I read this, but I definitely read after he was a Baha'i and he was on one of his trips to share the Baha'i teachings. He was on a train. He had bought a ticket on a train going from Ohio to Kentucky. And it was an overnight trip. And he had bought, because, he'd need to sleep on the train, he'd bought a pretty good class of service. When the train reached Kentucky, which of course meant that he was crossing into the South, he was told that he had to leave the car, the accommodations that he had paid for. And he said, and he refused because he had paid for them and he should have them. Well, he ended up actually, according to this account, I'll have to verify it, and I'll have to look again to see where I actually read it. He ended up spending a night or two in jail as a result of his refusal to voluntarily leave his accommodation.
Yeah, it seems to me I'd heard something about that too. Then there's also another interesting question here about whether you have any information about Louis Gregory's interaction with the first South Carolina Baha'i. I believe that was Alonzo Twine.
No, I do not. Although I guarantee you that if one wanted to get a specific answer to that, Louis Venters would definitely know any details about any such interaction that may or may not have occurred.
Right. Yeah, he's written about it in his book on the beginnings of the faith in South Carolina. We have one person, Alan Smith, saying, "Thank you so much for this wonderful unveiling of these truths about the contributions of African-American lawyers to the advance of justice. Gratefully, Alan Smith." So that's one of his comments. That right now is the sum total of the questions that I've seen. There's one thing I wanted to ask. I'm trying to think about what it was. How many, it sounds like there's been quite a few African Americans who have gone to Harvard, Howard, and I think you mentioned Yale in particular. And I'm kind of curious about Harvard's record this way of inviting or accepting African Americans to the law school.
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. You know, I mean, there have been many African American lawyers, and there's a tendency to focus on the ones who have made the headlines, I suppose, in some sense. But I guarantee you that there are many who have done all sorts of work going to law schools other than Harvard, Yale, Howard, and Columbia. Of course, Howard was special because, generally speaking, it was the only place where African Americans could get a superb legal education without the barrier of being excluded simply on the basis of their race, especially if they were from the South. You know, of course, Massachusetts has always tried to, or at least it's been liberal in many ways, and one of the ways is in the manner in which, to some extent, Harvard has admitted African Americans. But it's important not to overstate that, because there's a very good book called, and I wish I had gone through it more thoroughly, but if you really wanted to get a good sense of the breakdown of where African Americans have gone to law school, there's a book called Emancipation, The Making of the Black Lawyer, from 1844 to 1944. And it's by Clay Smith, who was a faculty member. In fact, I think he was a dean at the Howard University Law School. And it's a really detailed history of what actually occurred among African-American lawyers in the United States for about 100 years.
There are several people who've raised their hands, and I don't know if I really want to be trying to turn on microphones and turning them back off because of the possible audio problems, but one of those people at least has clicked on the chat function and posted her comment there, and I would encourage anyone else who has a comment or question to post it to the chat box. It's pretty easy. You can just click on, if you hover your mouse down below the images and everything, you'll see a menu bar, and on the menu bar you can click on chat and you get a little box and you can type your comment there. Sandy says, did any of the wonderful people you mentioned near the end of your presentation also become Baha'is?
Let's see. Loretta Lynch, Eric Holder, Lonnie Guinier, Patricia Harris. The only one who had a chance was Clyde Ferguson, but his sister was a Baha'i and he knew about the faith, but as far as I know, never quite reached the point. He certainly was favorably disposed towards it. The rest, as far as I know, did not become Baha'is. Mm-hmm. Now, we know a few things like W.E.B. Du Bois was very familiar with the Baha'i faith, very favorably disposed towards it as a result of meeting Abdu'l-Bahá. And as we covered earlier, noted earlier, he He dedicated 2 issues of The Crisis to Abdu'l-Bahá's visit to the United States and the talks that he gave. But also, Du Bois's first wife was a Baha'i. And after she passed away, he married again, and his second wife was also a Baha'i. So that's about, as far as I know, among the people that we've talked about today, those are the connections that I'm aware of.
Ida B. Wells certainly had a close connection with the Chicago Baha'is because she lived in Chicago, I guess, towards the end of her life. And I'm under the impression that I saw somewhere that she was on the 1918 Chicago Baha'i membership list, but then not subsequently. So I gather from that she was certainly close to the Baha'i community in Chicago. She is a really remarkable lady. She's one of the real fascinating people of that era, from what I can see.
Yeah, truly.
And she was married to a white man too, if I remember. If the person I'm thinking of.
I saw a photo, and it's hard to tell.
Yeah. And I think they may also have been connected to the Lincoln Center, which was this particular church Abdu'l-Bahá spoke at in Chicago in 1912. So, and no doubt knew Abbott and associated quite a lot with Hull House and all that. Anyway, Larry Beard also asks this question: what year did Louis Gregory travel to Haiti, and did he open a school there?
Good question. I don't know the answer to it. I know that I've read about it in Gail Morrison's book, To Move the World. It's definitely covered in there. So that's, one can definitely get the answer to that question in that book. Right. I think, in fact, an entire chapter in that book is devoted to his stay in Haiti.
Because he was able to go with his wife in that particular case also. So they were able to go pioneering together, it seems to me. My impression is that it was the year before the beginning of the 7-year plan, so it would have been 36. And he was only there, they were only there for a few months, if I remember right. But it's all there in the book, and he certainly didn't have a chance to open a school. Larry may be thinking of the Anis Zanouzi School, which is a Baha'i school in Haiti that was opened in the late 70s, I think it was. I think that's all of our questions. I don't see any others right offhand. And I'm taking a quick look here. Let me go check the YouTube channel as well. There was, I think Steve Collins has done a little more research. George Gregory was first sergeant of Company C of the 104th, and Thornton Chase was captain and commander of Company D. So that's the answer to that question. He asks about the relationship between Louis Gregory and Horace Holley, and if you know anything about that.
That's also covered in To Move the World. I don't know how complete that coverage is. I know that they had agreements on some things. These were people with strong personalities in many ways and views, and disagreements on some other things, and a little bit of tension at some point between the two of them. But towards the end of their lives, letters that display an affection between the two men.
Yeah, and let me see if there's anything else here. I think, well, there is another question. Is there much known about the small black community of interest in the faith in Washington, D.C. when Louis Gregory was exploring the religion?
You mean by community of interest, I assume is meant the other Black Baha'is, other Black Americans who are investigating the Baha'i faith or somehow closely associated with the Baha'i community.
Right.
Yeah, that is a very interesting topic. I know there are some people who have been doing a fair amount of research in that area. There's an amateur historian named, oh God, the name is escaping me. He's originally from one of the Baltic states. Rob, you probably know of him.
Not by name, right offhand, I don't think. He lives in Washington?
He lived in Washington until very recently. I think he just moved to Central Virginia. But the name will come to me at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
But anyway, there definitely has been a rising level of research, and it's a very interesting story. And there was even a ceremony just a year ago, roughly, for one of these early for putting a dignified tombstone at the grave of one of these early
Pocahontas Pope, I think it was.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Very lovely ceremony.
Yeah, and there is quite a large number. There were, I think, a reasonable number of African Americans in the Washington, D.C. Baha'i community at that time, right up to the visit of Abdu'l-Bahá. And someone does need to sit down and kind of pull together the list of names and dig through the correspondence and the various other records that are available, archival materials at the time, and put that story together, because that really would be a very interesting story.
Yes.
It's the first really racially integrated Baha'i community in the United States, and the one with the largest number of African Americans in that very early period of time. And I'm sure that has a lot to do with Louis Gregory too, with his connections and with his loving way to present the faith to a large number of contacts. He obviously was known by a large number of people in Washington, D.C. when he became a Baha'i. So
yeah. And the individual who's done a lot of research on that, his name is Lex Musta.
Oh yeah, I've heard his name.
And if certainly a Baha'i could find him on Unity Web, and his knowledge about this is encyclopedic.
Well, it looks like pretty much all the questions. I do have this one comment here. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. It showed the importance of history, how it is relevant still today in the ongoing struggle for justice, and how history can provide spiritual upliftment. And I certainly would echo those sentiments very much. Certainly, I think that's the main point of, many ways, one of the main points of history is to understand where we're at and, our situation in the context of what's gone before us. So certainly I agree with that person. Let me see there. It looks like there may be a few more here in the Q&A. Alan also asks, are you planning to publish this as an article at some point?
Possibly, but I don't have any plans to do it in the immediate term. If there's enough demand, I suppose, if it's considered a useful service, then perhaps, I might do that.
Certainly we'll have the videotape up on our YouTube channel, and the PowerPoint is already up on the webpage for this particular talk at wilmetinstitute.org. Then one looks under 2019 Web Talks. Larry also asked this question: were there any concrete results that came out of the early race amity conventions?
Wonderful question. I do not know. I think that would be an excellent research project for someone to undertake in the archives of the National Baha'i Center, because there's no doubt in my mind, or I'd be extremely surprised given how much the early Baha'is put down on paper, especially when they were serving in administrative committees. I would bet that quite a bit could be learned from that.
Yeah, I suspect that that's true. Well, I think that's everything that we have today. I don't see any other questions or comments anywhere. So again, Anthony, thank you so much for this fascinating and illuminating presentation. Well-timed for Race Unity Day. And I'm hoping that we will now have people come back in July for our presentations on the Gayom al-Asma by Todd Lawson. So with that, I want to thank everyone for watching our presentation today, and we look forward to seeing you again at another time.
Great. Thank you all very much. It's a pleasure.
Thanks.